Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well. Welcome, bienvenidos, espero que todos estén muy bien. So in this video we are going to review the imperfect verb tense and then we are going to practice with it. So the imperfect verb tense is one of the past tenses in Spanish. It's actually a very robust verb tense in the sense that a verb in the imperfect verb tense in Spanish will convey several different meanings in English. So we're going to look at all that and we're going to do some practice. So the first thing here is you have to know the mechanics of the conjugation. So when you want to take an infinitive in Spanish, either an AR, ER, or IR infinitive, remember that an infinitive is a verb that hasn't been conjugated. It doesn't have a subject yet, and it doesn't have a tense or a time. So you take your infinitives and you go through this little three-step process. You start with your infinitive, for example, hablar, to speak. You remove the AR, that's step 2, and that leaves you with the root or the stem. It's either called the root or the stem. It's the same thing. And then all you have to do is add an ending to that root or stem. This is a similar process that you go through with other verb tenses. For example, the present tense, you'll see that three-step process is very similar. You do the same thing with the preterite verb tense. So the ending is what's different here. You have to memorize these endings. There is absolutely no way around it. Native speakers, as you know, just memorize through practice. So the more you practice, the better off you'll be. So spend a little time getting familiar with these forms, these endings. For the yo, it's haba. For tú, habas. Usted, él, or ella, haba. Nosotros or nosotras, habamos. Notice the accent mark. Vosotros or vosotras, habáis. And then ustedes, ellos, or ellas, haban. So haba, habas, haba, habamos, habáis, haban. You'll hear these endings. This is what marks it as the imperfect. When you're listening to somebody speak and you hear these endings, your brain will register imperfect. Okay. So for ER, IR verbs, notice that the endings are identical. So you really only have to learn 2 sets of endings. So it's ia, ias. And notice the accent mark. That's really important for the pronunciation. That's where you put the stress. So ia, ias, ia, iamos, iais, ian. Ia, ias, ia, iamos, iais, ian. Memorize this. And once you've done that, you know the mechanics of it, you know this 3-step process, you just add that little ending to it, and then you have your verb in the imperfect. So let's do a little bit of conjugation practice. Let's not worry about what that form means for the moment. Let's just do the mechanics of it here. For example, for yo, what form would you get in the imperfect for estudiar? You would get yo estudiaba. Yo estudiaba. Yo estudiaba. Estudiaba. Ella, and manejar, to drive. What would this be in the imperfect? Ella manejaba. Ella manejaba. Ella manejaba. We're putting the stress here, second to the last syllable. Manejaba. That's the normal stress for a word that ends in a vowel. It's second to the last. Ella manejaba. Trabajar. Trabajar, nosotros. Nosotros trabajábamos. Nosotros trabajábamos. We're putting the stress on this syllable because the accent mark is there. Trabajábamos. Nosotros trabajábamos. Nosotros trabajábamos. An IR verb, escribir. Again, you have to have these endings memorized. Tú escribías. Tú escribías. Tú escribías. Ellos, leer. Ellos leían. Ellos leían. Ellos leían. Notice the stress there on that I. And it's 3 separate syllables here. Leían. 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 Okay, so now that you're familiar with the mechanics of it, let's take a look at the meanings. What does a verb mean when it's in the imperfect verb tense in Spanish? So the imperfect verb tense describes actions that are seen as incomplete or continuing in the past. In other words, we're talking about actions that went on and on, or that were repetitive or habitual in the past. When we use the imperfect, we're not really concerned with when the action started to occur and then when it ended. When it ended is the concern of the preterite verb tense, but with the imperfect, this just emphasized the fact that it was done over and over at some point in the past. The preterite, on the other hand, describes actions that are considered completed. So it's very important to understand those two different general uses of the preterite and the imperfect, to understand them both. I will have a separate video on preterite versus imperfect, but this gives you a really good idea of what will happen in that video if you understand the two concepts. Okay, so when I put a verb in the imperfect, you can get these four possible meanings here. Starting with this example here, yo estudiaba en la biblioteca. If you ask me, what does this mean? I will say, my answer will be, pues depende. It depends. It depends on whether you're talking about the fact that it was a habitual action, it was done over and over at some point in the past, or if you were talking about an action that was occurring at a particular moment in the past or a particular time period. They're very similar, but they're also different. So let's take a look at the meanings we get in English. 1, 2, and 3 are basically the exact same meaning. We just have three different ways of wording this in English. So yo estudiaba en la biblioteca means I used to study in the library. That when you say used to, it means you did it over and over at some time period in the past. We can also say I always studied in the library. When I say, notice that this is studied. This is the preterite in English actually. But when we use always, it implies over and over again. So I always studied and I used to study mean exactly the same thing here in this context. I always studied in the library. Well, when I was a freshman, you might say, in college, I always studied in the library. That means I used to study in the library. Another way that we word that in English is by using would. Not the would like I would do it if I would go if you gave me the money or something like that. We're using the would here to mean repetitive in the past. So I would study in the library. The always, if someone does not use the word always, I would always study in the library, it's implied here. I would always study in the library. Or when I was a freshman, I would study in the library. Maybe you'll say something like all the time. And it implies that over and over again. So estudiaba means these three things in English. We just have three different ways of saying the same thing. To help you get a feeling of understanding of the imperfect, I would suggest just to think of it as the used to verb tense. In other words, you did it over and over again. Now this fourth meaning, I was studying in the library. We usually use this in conjunction with another activity that occurred that interrupted it, and we're going to look at that later in the video. For now, just know that estudiaba en la biblioteca means, well, I was studying in the library when something else happened, when someone called or I heard a loud noise or whatever. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. Just think of this as think of the imperfect as the used to do verb tense or the was doing verb tense, because it describes things you used to do or someone else used to do, or things you were doing or someone else was doing. Okay, so if I want to say I used to eat hamburgers in Spanish, it would be yo comía hamburguesas. I used to eat hamburgers maybe before I started my diet or whatever. Yo comía hamburguesas. I used to eat hamburgers. I used to work at a bank. ¿Cómo se dice? Imperfect. Yo trabajaba en un banco. I used to work in a bank. Yo trabajaba en un banco. Remember, I'm not concerned with when I started working in the bank and the time that I stopped working in the bank. I'm just focusing on the fact that for a time period in the past, I did this over and over again. Yo trabajaba en un banco. She used to play soccer. ¿Cómo se dice en español? En castellano, español. Ella jugaba al fútbol. Ella jugaba al fútbol. She used to play soccer. You used to help me. Tú me ayudabas. Tú ayudabas, you used to help, and notice that the me we put before the conjugated verb instead of after like in English. So, tú me ayudabas. You used to help me. He used to work here. ¿Cómo se dice he used to work here? Él trabajaba aquí. Él trabajaba aquí. Él trabajaba aquí. He used to work here. ¿Cómo se dice she used to walk to school? She always walked to school. She would walk to school. All the same thing. Ella caminaba a la escuela. Ella caminaba, ella caminaba a la escuela. She used to walk to the school. Or simply, she used to walk to school. We used to play in the park. ¿Cómo se dice? We used to play in the park. Jugábamos en el parque. Notice the accented syllable here. Jugábamos, jugábamos. Jugábamos en el parque. We used to play in the park. Jugábamos en el parque. They used to live in Miami. Ellos vivían en Miami. Ellos vivían en Miami. They used to dance very well. Ellas bailaban muy bien. Ellas bailaban muy bien. They used to dance very well. They always danced very well. They would always dance very well. Same thing. Ellas bailaban muy bien. Okay, so let's look at this next use of the imperfect. The imperfect also expresses what was happening at a certain time. For example, if I want to say in Spanish, Jorge was studying, I would say, Jorge estudiaba. Now this is just a part of the puzzle. I'll put it together in just a minute. I was eating. Also the imperfect. Yo comía. Remember, yo comía can mean I used to eat, but it also has another meaning, which is I was eating. Yo comía. She was working. Ella trabajaba. Ella trabajaba. Okay, so we use this for two actions that were happening at the same time in the past using the word mientras. Mientras means while, W-H-I-L-E, so while. For example, if I want to say, I was studying while you were watching TV, we're talking about what was happening at a particular moment in the past. Here's a different example. I was working while she was studying. How would you say I was working while she was studying? Use mientras for while. Put it all together. So it's imperfect, imperfect. Two verbs in the imperfect connected with mientras. Yo trabajaba mientras ella estudiaba. I was working while she was studying. Yo trabajaba mientras ella estudiaba. Yo trabajaba mientras ella estudiaba. He was eating while I was watching TV. He was eating. So you have comer, comía, right? Mientras yo miraba la televisión. Él comía mientras yo miraba la tele. Él comía mientras yo miraba la tele. Él comía mientras yo miraba la tele. He was eating while I was watching TV. So we also use the imperfect along with the preterite in a very special case to say that something was happening when another action interrupted it. So we just practice with using the imperfect to mean that something was happening. And now we're, instead of two verbs in the imperfect, we're going to have one in the imperfect and one in the preterite. The one in the preterite is the action that interrupted it. Okay, so this is where we use the imperfect and the preterite together. So let's look at some examples. I was talking on the phone when he knocked on the door. So I was talking is going to be imperfect, and then he knocked is going to be in the preterite. So we have hablar por teléfono for talking, and tocar a la puerta to knock on the door. So I was talking, yo, in the imperfect, and then él, and then tocar in the preterite. And our answer is, yo hablaba por teléfono, cuando, so we use the word cuando for when, yo hablaba por teléfono cuando él tocó a la puerta. Yo hablaba por teléfono cuando él tocó a la puerta. I was talking on the phone when he knocked on the door. She was working when the phone rang. So trabajar for work and sonar el teléfono. ¿Cómo se dice? She was working when the phone rang. Ella trabajaba cuando sonó el teléfono. Ella trabajaba cuando sonó el teléfono. Ella trabajaba cuando sonó el teléfono. Okay, well that's it for this review, introduction, and practice with the imperfect verb tense. Remember that you can find all of my Spanish videos on my channel homepage in YouTube. There's also a playlist of Spanish topics. You can look at there's actually more than one playlist. You can look at my different Spanish playlists. Okay, well, I will have a follow-up video to this one that will give you some more information about the preterite, so be on the lookout for that. Okay, es todo. Hasta luego. Chao.